The lounge was quiet in that calculated way only expensive places could be. Cream leather chairs lined up beside polished glass tables, soft jazz murmured in the background, and a line of business travelers scrolled their phones without looking up. Then she walked in. She wasn't loud or clumsy. She didn't wear heels that clicked or perfume that lingered. Her shoes were flat and faded, the kind worn for comfort rather than style, and her coat looked like it had seen many winters. She stood near the counter holding a paper boarding pass, like someone who hadn't flown first class before. A woman in pearls leaned close to her husband and whispered something that made them both smile small and sideways. The man behind her adjusted his Rolex and let out a breath loud enough to be a comment. The staff member at the desk glanced up, then back at the screen, and didn't bother to greet her. Still, the woman didn't fidget. She didn't shift her weight or seem to notice the silence folding around her. She waited her turn calm as a lake on a windless morning. When it came, the staff's voice was clipped. "Business class check-in is around the corner." Her response was only a nod. She didn't argue. She just stepped forward and offered her ticket, the kind that shouldn't need explanation. For a second, something flickered in the younger attendant's eyes. Maybe recognition, maybe doubt. But no one said a word. The room returned to scrolling and whispering. She took a seat by the window far from the food and the crowd. The city blinked beyond the glass, but she didn't look out. She sat with the stillness of someone who had been here before, just not in the way anyone else thought. 15 minutes later, something would happen, and not one of them would be ready for it. Section 1. Character Introduction. Evelyn Clark had never cared much for appearances. At 53, her hair had turned silver around the edges, soft and natural, like she hadn't tried to hide it. Her cardigan hung a little loose at the sleeves, and her shoes, once navy, had faded to something between blue and gray. She wasn't the kind of woman people turned to look at. That suited her just fine. She liked being in the quiet, moving through the world without needing it to notice her. What mattered to Evelyn was what she gave, not what she wore. For 30 years, she'd taught literature at a small public school tucked between a freeway and a laundromat. Most of her students came from families too tired to read bedtime stories, too busy trying to make rent. Evelyn made it her mission to give those kids something permanent, something they could hold in their minds when the world got noisy. Books were her bridge. She taught them how to write a line that could carry emotion, how to read between words and see their own lives reflected in characters who lived centuries ago. She stayed late to help with college essays, came in early to proof scholarships, and sometimes drove kids to interviews when buses failed them. Her husband Samuel used to say she poured herself out like a pitcher with no bottom. He meant it as a compliment, though it sometimes came with a worried smile. They married young, lived in a modest brick home with creaky floors and a porch that held summer better than most places. He passed away 10 years ago. Cancer, swift and brutal. Evelyn never remarried. Her grief was private like most of her life. But she kept teaching, kept showing up, kept making a quiet difference no one ever printed in the papers. The only thing she ever asked for was that her students never give up on themselves. A few of them didn't. One in particular, a boy named Mateo, had stayed in touch long after high school ended. He called her when his mom lost her job, when he got into community college, when he thought he might quit. Evelyn always answered. She believed in him in the way good teachers do, completely without condition. And when he applied to Stanford, she wrote the kind of letter that makes admissions committees pause. What no one knew was that she also wrote a check. It wasn't flashy. She didn't want her name on anything. She just wanted him to have a shot. She'd saved for it quietly over years, canceling vacations, skipping dinners out, clipping grocery coupons the way her mother once did. Her name didn't need to be on the donor wall. It only needed to be on the list that made him eligible for a full ride. Now, he was graduating. First in his family, first in his neighborhood. Evelyn wasn't going to miss that moment for anything in the world. So she packed her small suitcase, printed her boarding pass, and made her way to the airport. There was nothing expensive about her luggage, just a zip-up bag with a Stanford pin she'd added for good luck. She sat by the window at the gate ticket tucked in her book and waited for the plane that would take her across the country. No one around her knew why she was flying. They saw only a quiet woman in worn shoes. But Evelyn knew, and that was always enough. Section 2. Setting the scene. The lounge sat like an island above the noise of the airport. Glass walls kept the chaos out while soft leather seats polished wood tables, and a steady stream of curated music kept the mood comfortably detached. Every detail was designed to whisper class without ever raising its voice. Attendants moved like dancers, discreet and composed, offering sparkling water espresso and truffle almonds to anyone with a platinum card or a tailored suit. Screens flickered with stock updates. Phones lit up with international calls and boarding notifications. Everything gleamed, from the fixtures to the teeth of the man in the corner, who hadn't stopped smiling since he walked in. When Evelyn stepped through the frosted doors, it was like someone had dragged a suitcase across silk. She didn't mean to interrupt anything. She simply moved toward the check-in desk, carrying herself like someone who belonged in the world, even if not in that room. Her shoes made soft, uneven taps across the polished floor. The fabric of her coat caught on the strap of her bag, and she had to adjust it with one hand, while fishing out her boarding pass with the other. The man in line behind her looked up from his phone and raised an eyebrow. He didn't say anything, but his glance did the work for him. The woman beside him leaned in and whispered something behind her palm. They both smiled in that way that says, "She must be lost." The attendant at the desk glanced at Evelyn, blinked, and then dropped her gaze to the screen again. Her voice was polite but practiced with an edge just sharp enough to catch. "Business class is around the corner," she said. Evelyn didn't argue. She slid the pass across the counter. For a moment the attendant hesitated. Her eyes landed on the name printed in black ink. Something about it gave her pause, but she didn't speak it out loud. She handed the ticket back and gestured without looking up. Evelyn nodded and moved quietly to a seat near the far end of the room. The chairs were overstuffed and sleek, too wide for one person, but too stiff to be welcoming. She chose the one closest to the window, the one least likely to invite a conversation. Outside planes taxied across the tarmac like steel animals, graceful and heavy. She opened her book, a well-worn paperback with creased corners and underlined lines. Her fingers traced the words like someone visiting an old friend. She didn't sip the wine or eat the almonds. She didn't unfold the napkin or scan the menu. She simply read. The others glanced her way now and then, just long enough to confirm that she still didn't belong. She didn't check her phone or adjust her watch. She didn't take a call or refresh her inbox. She just sat, a quiet presence in a room that didn't know what to do with quiet. The wall between her and the others wasn't made of glass or wood. It was made of fabric labels, brand names, and the way people looked at shoes before faces. It didn't need to be spoken to be felt. She felt it. But Evelyn wasn't new to rooms like this. She'd walked into them before, not always with a plane to catch, but with a purpose just the same. Classrooms, school boards, fundraisers, board meetings, all filled with people who thought kindness had a dress code. She folded her book in her lap and stared out the window, eyes unfocused. Somewhere on the other side of the country, a young man was ironing his gown and calling his mother to ask if she was proud. Evelyn had told him she'd be there. She always kept her promises. In the lounge, someone laughed too loudly at a joke no one else heard. The attendant poured another glass of wine. A man in a tailored jacket checked his watch twice in 60 seconds. Everything carried on as if her presence had never touched the air. No one knew what was coming. Not yet. Section 3. Conflict. Silent disrespect. 3.1. Words that cut without a blade. The lounge had grown quiet again, filled only with the soft hum of climate control and the occasional clink of a spoon against fine china. Evelyn sat still, her book unopened in her lap, as the staff member who had first checked her in returned to the desk with a clipboard. She gave Evelyn a long glance, before leaning in toward a colleague and speaking in a voice just loud enough to carry. She asked if anyone had confirmed her seat assignment. Her eyes flicked toward Evelyn, then back to the paper lips pressed into a line. It wasn't the words themselves that stung, but the suggestion buried in them. Like Evelyn had snuck in through a side door and no one quite knew what to do about her. Across the lounge, an older woman with carefully styled hair and a pearl necklace whispered something to her husband. Her voice was too low to catch completely, but her eyes lingered on Evelyn's cardigan. The husband gave a soft chuckle and didn't bother looking away when she turned back toward the window. It wasn't loud or direct. No one called her names or raised a hand, but every glance, every half-smile and sideways whisper added up like stones in a pocket. Heavy and silent. She could feel it in the way people straightened their backs when she walked by, in how they angled their bodies slightly away from hers, like she carried something contagious. One of the younger travelers dropped his voice while on the phone and muttered something about standards. It was followed by a pause and a glance in Evelyn's direction. He didn't need to explain what he meant. The room seemed to agree without saying a word. Evelyn stayed quiet. Her posture didn't shift. Her hands remained folded around the book, thumbs brushing its worn spine. She didn't answer their stares or their assumptions. She just kept breathing the same air, sitting in the same seat, waiting for the same flight. The space between her and the rest of the lounge had grown thicker, not with sound, but with discomfort, the kind of unease that comes when someone refuses to fit neatly into the box others have built. She wasn't loud enough to be offensive, rich enough to be admired, or stylish enough to be envied. She simply existed, and for some reason that was enough to bother them. 3.2. She didn't flinch. Evelyn didn't shift in her seat. She heard the whispers, felt the glances, and understood exactly what they meant. But she didn't let any of it touch her face. When the staff member approached again with a question veiled as a reminder, Evelyn reached calmly into her bag. Her fingers moved without urgency. She pulled out her boarding pass and passport and handed them over with the quiet certainty of someone who had nothing to prove. The woman took them with a forced smile, eyes scanning quickly. She paused when she saw the name just for a second, as if something familiar surfaced, but stayed unspoken. She cleared her throat and nodded, handing the documents back with more care than before. Evelyn accepted them with a soft thank you and tucked them away without breaking her posture. She didn't gloat or make eye contact. She didn't glance around to see who had watched. Her dignity lived in the spaces between all those things. Nearby, the younger attendant who had been restocking the snack table looked up. He'd caught the name on the boarding pass and now studied her a moment longer. Recognition passed through his eyes, but it didn't reach his lips. He lowered his gaze and returned to his work. Evelyn turned slightly in her chair and reopened her book. The pages fell back to a dog-eared corner and she continued where she had left off. She hadn't raised her voice or corrected anyone. She hadn't needed to. There was power in her stillness. It was the kind of strength that came from knowing who you are even when no one else does. She didn't chase approval. She didn't chase anything. The others around her began to quiet, not out of respect but confusion, the kind that creeps in when judgments don't land the way they're meant to. Evelyn gave them nothing to react to. She just remained present, whole. And somewhere in that stillness a small shift began, not in them, not yet, but in the space around her, the sense that something didn't quite add up, and the feeling that maybe they'd misjudged the quiet woman by the window. Section 4. Inner Life and Values. 4.1. The chapters behind her eyes. Long before she sat in that airport lounge, Evelyn had spent her life in classrooms that smelled of chalk and dust and old radiator heat. The school sat between a bus depot and a row of boarded-up storefronts, the kind of place most teachers cycled through. But Evelyn stayed. Her students came from everywhere. Countries she had only read about in books, spoken through accents stitched with fear, pride, and broken English. Some arrived without lunch, some without shoes that fit. All of them came with stories no one had asked to hear. Evelyn listened. She stayed after school and let them talk while she graded essays or taped up torn textbooks. She learned their names, their siblings' names, the corners they had to walk past, and the ones they tried to avoid. When the cafeteria closed too early, she brought granola bars from home. When the library budget disappeared, she used her own paycheck to order books she thought would matter. Not the ones on school lists, the ones with characters who looked like her kids, who fought like them, dreamed like them, survived like them. There was a jar in her kitchen marked Field Trip Fund. She filled it with loose change and birthday cash she never spent. She'd slip bills into it when no one was watching. She never told the students who paid for their bus rides or museum entry. She just smiled when they asked if they could go. Her husband Samuel used to tease her about that jar. He'd say she gave away more than she kept. But he admired it too. He called her the quiet flood, gentle and unstoppable. They were married 15 years before cancer took him. It happened fast. Too fast. Grief hit Evelyn like wind in winter. Not loud, just sharp and lasting. But even in the worst of it, she never stopped showing up for her students. They were the one thing she could still give to. The one place her love had somewhere to land. She never asked for recognition. She never counted how many she helped. What mattered to her was the small shift she saw when a kid believed they were smart for the first time, or when a college acceptance letter made them cry in the hallway. Her life was full of stories no one wrote down. No magazine features, no awards, just quiet wins, one child at a time, one page at a time. And even now, sitting among strangers who couldn't see past her worn cardigan, Evelyn carried all of that in her. The late nights, the whispered confessions, the essays scribbled in second languages. They lived behind her eyes like chapters only she remembered. And that was enough. 4.2. A life of intention. Evelyn never saw the point in chasing after things that didn't last. Fancy labels, shiny cars, restaurants that charged by the garnish instead of the meal. Those things had their place, but they never held her interest for long. Her joy came from quieter places. The sound of a student reading out loud for the first time without stumbling. The way her porch smelled after a summer rain. The soft weight of her old cardigan, the one that had been with her through 10 winters, and every tough parent-teacher conference. She wore that cardigan to the airport not because it was the nicest thing she owned, but because it reminded her of who she was. It had threads pulled loose and buttons that didn't match, but it had a history, and Evelyn liked things with history. She believed in living with intention. She didn't spend just to spend or speak just to fill silence. Her days were shaped around purpose, her nights around peace. She saved what she could not to build a bigger house, but to build someone else's future. When people talked about success, she listened politely. Then she went back to doing what mattered, writing notes in the margins of student papers, sending birthday cards to kids who didn't get many, donating quietly always without asking for credit. She found wealth in different places, in laughter that came from deep in the belly, in memories made without photos, in the letters she kept in a small wooden box written by former students who said she changed their lives. Her version of luxury was time. Time to sit with a book, time to walk without rushing, time to make someone feel seen. Sometimes she thought about how much people missed while chasing applause, how often they ran past the real treasure too distracted by flash to notice depth. Evelyn didn't want to be noticed. She wanted to be useful. She didn't decorate her life with trends. She filled it with meaning. And when she looked around that lounge filled with polished shoes and gold watches, she didn't feel small. She felt steady. Her life wasn't loud, but it was hers, chosen, honest, and full. Section 5. The Reveal. Just as the final boarding call echoed through the terminal, a man in a dark suit stepped into the lounge. He carried himself with authority, the kind that came from years of directing others without raising his voice. He scanned the room briefly before walking straight toward Evelyn. He stopped a few feet from her chair and said her name softly like it was familiar. Evelyn Clark. There was a pause just long enough for people nearby to glance up. He smiled the respectful kind and asked if she would come with him. She closed her book, nodded once, and stood without fuss. As she followed him through the quiet lounge, the ones who had stared before were now watching again. But something had shifted. They didn't know why yet, but they could feel it. The man held the door open as if he knew exactly who she was. Because he did. He led her past the gate and through a private corridor most passengers never see. The carpet changed under her feet, thicker, quieter. At the end of the hall, a door opened into a small room filled with light and quiet voices. There were 6 students inside, standing in a loose circle, talking in that nervous, excited way people do before something big. When they saw Evelyn, they stopped. Then they smiled. Big, open, familiar smiles. One of them stepped forward, eyes bright, and called her name like it meant something. Because, to them it did. She hugged each one of them gently, arms wrapped in that same old cardigan. No one noticed what she wore. They only saw her. Their mentor. Their silent champion. Their reason. These were the first full graduates from the scholarship fund she had started over a decade ago. Back when Mateo, her former student, had told her he was scared to apply to college because he couldn't afford it. Back when she had written her first check with no foundation. Behind her name, just trust in the potential of a kid who needed a break. She never told the world what she was doing. Never asked for photos or plaques or press releases. She wanted the focus to stay on the students, not on her. But the school had reached out this year. They asked if she would consider joining a small ceremony in California, a private celebration for the quiet donor whose gifts had changed so many lives. She had agreed. Not for the recognition, for the kids. Now here they were, holding boarding passes, carrying duffel bags and nerves and dreams, and she was going with them, to watch them walk across that stage, to be in the room when their names were called. The man in the suit stepped back, letting the moment belong to them. Evelyn smiled, not the small kind she gave to strangers, but the deep one that came from knowing she had done something that mattered. She looked around and saw not just faces, but futures. Back in the lounge, the seats were being emptied. Passengers moved toward the gate, still unaware of what they had missed. The older woman with the pearls stood beside her husband, straightening his collar, both of them watching the attendants with practiced impatience. The young man, who had scoffed earlier, tapped at his phone, lost in whatever couldn't wait. None of them saw Evelyn walk past. Not this time. As she moved through the terminal with her group, no one stopped her. The staff nodded, respectful now, a trace of something different in their eyes. Not apology, just awareness. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. Her story wasn't for them anyway. It was for the kids beside her, the ones who would graduate, the ones who would remember her, and one day maybe quietly become someone like her. When Evelyn re-entered the lounge, it was only for a moment. She had returned with the group of students not to linger, but to reach the gate on the far end of the terminal. Still, the brief walk through the room was enough to shift something in the air. The staff who had once ignored her now straightened their posture. One of them gave a slight nod, unsure whether to speak. Another glanced down quickly, pretending to read a clipboard that had nothing on it. The woman in pearls caught sight of the group and instinctively reached for her necklace, eyes narrowing with slow recognition. No one said her name. No one apologized. But the looks followed her, different from before. Not dismissive this time. Just quiet, a little unsure, filled with the weight of an unspoken truth. The man who had joked at her expense stood off to the side, phone, lowered lips slightly parted. He didn't look angry. He looked like someone who had just realized they'd misread the story entirely. His gaze stayed on the students, then flicked back to Evelyn like he couldn't decide whether to feel embarrassed or impressed. Evelyn walked at a steady pace. She didn't rush. She didn't shrink. Her smile was soft, the kind that says, "Everything's all right, even when it isn't." When she passed the attendant who had questioned her ticket, she gave a small nod. The attendant blinked and gave a quick one in return. She didn't need them to say anything. That had never been the point. What mattered was the silence that followed her, thicker, now shaped not by judgment but by awareness. It was the kind of silence that made people rethink things, the kind that lingered longer than noise. No one rushed to stop her or offer a second chance. They just stood still, letting her pass. She didn't look for their reactions. She didn't measure the moment by how it landed. She simply moved forward with the same quiet dignity she'd carried the whole time. Behind her, the lounge remained polished, controlled, as if trying to reset itself. But something in it had changed. Not loudly, just enough. Enough to make a few people wonder what other truths they'd missed. Enough to plant the smallest seed of humility. Evelyn never looked back. There was nothing waiting for her in that room. Everything that mattered was ahead, and she carried it with her, not in her bag, in her steps. Evelyn took her seat by the window, settling into the quiet hum of the cabin. The students were nearby, voices low and excited, their eyes filled with the kind of hope she had spent her life trying to protect. She smiled as one of them looked back to wave before buckling in. Outside, the tarmac stretched beneath a gray sky, soft with early clouds. The engines rumbled, faintly steady and sure, like the pulse of something inevitable. Evelyn rested her hands on her lap and leaned slightly toward the glass. She didn't feel pride in the way some people meant it. Not the loud kind, not the kind that asked to be noticed. What she felt was peace, the quiet, steady kind that comes from knowing you stayed true when it would have been easier to bend. She thought about the people in the lounge, their glances, their assumptions, their discomfort when they realized she was not who they had imagined. She held no anger toward them. They weren't cruel, just unseeing. Like so many people, they had been taught to trust surface over soul. Evelyn had never played by that rule. She dressed simply not because she had to, but because she wanted space for other things. Space for listening, for giving, for showing up. Her cardigan still held the faint scent of home, of old books and morning coffee. She rubbed her thumb along the frayed edge of the sleeve and let her thoughts drift back to the classroom, The hallway laughter, the quiet moments after students left when she'd sit alone and reread a line from Baldwin or Angelo and feel like she wasn't alone at all. Now she watched the world outside begin to move. The wings shifted, the plane crept forward, and Evelyn breathed in the stillness one last time before the sky opened to carry them west. In her heart a single sentence settled. Not bitter, just true. You judged me by my clothes, but you should have looked at my character. She closed her eyes for a moment and let that truth rest where it belonged. Not spoken, just lived. If this story stayed with you, take a moment to pass it along. Someone out there might need the reminder that grace doesn't always wear a name tag. Sometimes it shows up in cardigans and silence, and sometimes the quietest people leave the deepest legacy.